Hey guys, so we've talked about the stock market crash and how it affected Texas and got to see some images of what Texas was like during that time period. So now we're going to talk about what's known as the New Deal. The New Deal was a government programs that was started by the Roosevelt administration. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, is what he's often known as. And they were government programs that were first started under this time period. Some of them we still have today. So we're going to talk about those programs and what they did for the United States and for the everyday citizen, and how it expanded the size and the power of the federal government. So first of all, let's talk about FDR. So this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was president. He was the only president that was ever president for more than 2 terms. He was actually elected 4 terms, but only served 3 full terms and 1 year of his 4th term. So we'll talk a little bit more about him as we go forward in Texas history. But he was elected right after the Great Depression started in 1933, and then, like I said, was president until 1945. This is before the president was allowed to be only elected to 2 terms. Before, it was kind of just like an unwritten rule, and then after this, they made it an actual law where a president could only be elected to 2 terms. And so he, like I said, was elected to 4 terms, but his push was to get the country out of the Great Depression and into a better country than it was even before the Great Depression. And so this was FDR and his New Deal. So part of the New Deal were a bunch of different programs. So we're going to talk about 5 specifically, and then I'll go through a few extra ones as well. And so the first one is something that still exists today, and that's Social Security. So it was created to help out financially for those who retired, have disabilities, or have become widowed. And so Social Security is something that still exists today. People still pay into Social Security, and then when they retire, they get money every month from the government that they gave them to begin with, and so it's kind of a loan to the government that gets taken out of your paycheck, and then you get it back when you retire. Or if you're injured on the job or have any type of physical or mental disabilities, you can get Social Security as well. It means you're not able to work at your full capacity. And lastly, if you become widowed, you can also get Social Security. So that means that you used to have 2 incomes, and then your spouse passes away, you can also get Social Security for that reason as well. And so that program was set up to help people that out of work who have retired, have disabilities, or became widowed. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, employed millions of people, mostly men, to build streets, bridges, and public buildings. One of the public buildings that was built at this time period that I visited and that was at my college was the football stadium at my college. And so I will show you kind of what that looks like today. So here is what it looks like today. But actually on the back of this, which is the press box right here, there is a whole brick wall that goes around the entire stadium, and that is where it actually has a plaque that says built by the WPA. And so the bones of the stadium, not that it's obviously been renovated since then, but the back side of the stadium and the brick area and the dugout was built during the Great Depression under the Works Progress Administration and the WPA. So it employed millions of people, mostly, like I said, men, building streets, bridges, and other public buildings. So they essentially put them to work so they could pay them to build things that weren't necessary at the time, but they knew would help people get back to work. It would boost our economy and bring the economy back. And so the WPA built a lot of things all over the country and put millions of people back to work. The Bureau of Public Roads, BPR, worked on highway construction. Before this, most highways were not connected. They were not paved, and so the Public Roads Bureau built constructions. They worked on making highways better, more smooth, and they tried to connect them as well. And they put roads in national parks. So if you've ever been to a national park, they've probably been repaved and redone since then, but they were originally constructed by the Bureau of Public Roads during this time period. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC is what it's often called. If you've ever been to a bank, you've probably seen a sticker on the outside of the bank saying FDIC, and it's created to promote the public confidence and stability in the banking industry. We talked about how half the banks went out of business during the Great Depression. Well, now if a bank is struggling and you have money in that bank, you won't lose a majority of your money. They now insure up to $250,000. And so if you have $250,000 in one, you would lose that $1, but they insure everything below that. So if you have millions of dollars in the bank, you will lose, a lot of it, but you'll have at least $250,000. And so it insures that money, make sure that if the bank struggles or the bank goes out of business, you can still get up to $250,000 out of the bank that you had in there. And so this helped reinstill confidence in banks, because people before this, in the early 1900s, were very skeptical of banks. And so it wasn't until probably about 1900 where people started even putting money in banks. And then they had their money in banks for about 20, 30 years, and the Great Depression hit, and a lot of people lost confidence in this. So this Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was put in place to make sure that people would get their money if a bank ever had any issues. And lastly, the Public Works of Art Project, PWAP or PWAP, created to employ artists to decorate public buildings and parks. And so it wasn't just about the necessary things. It wasn't just about building public buildings and roads and things like that. They also wanted to promote culture and art as well. And so they had people paint murals on the sides of buildings. They held concerts and all kinds of different things. So we're going to check out a few more New Deal programs just so you get the scope of how many programs the government did create and how much power it gave the federal government. So we have economic and stimulus stabilizations, things very similar to what's happening today with the stimulus packages being passed as well. But a lot of programs were started, like the U.S. Travel Bureau, to encourage people to travel to the United States and within the United States to get more revenue to those places. The Emergency Bank Relief Act, all kinds of different things. The Gold Reserve Act, which made the government have a stockpile of gold at Fort Knox, was started in 1934. The Banking Act, different relief and welfare like Social Security as well. Public works projects, like I said, there's tons of different. We already talked about the WPA down here, but there's tons of other different works projects as well. More expansions. The U.S. Post Office Department was founded in 1792, has been around since pretty much the founding of our nation, but they also got expanded what they did and created more post offices as well. The Army Corps of Engineers, that was founded in 1802, was expanded, but their role was expanded in what they did. They built levees and dams and canals across the country. They built the Missouri River Basin as well. Here's some arts and culture programs that we talked about that were put in place. More public works reorganizations, rural assistance. This was very important because the Dust Bowl was also happening at the same time. The Farm Credit Act, this is put in place and is still used today. A lot of farmers obviously couldn't afford the equipment that they needed, and so they would get credit from the government, pay for their tractors and other supplies they needed, and then after harvest they could pay their loans back. Like I said, there's just tons of different programs that were put in place during the Great Depression that helped get the country out of it, and many of them we still use today. Here's land and wildlife conservation, regulation of trade, transport communications, and they also had different acts and laws passed for Native American lands and U.S. territories around the world. All right, so that is the New Deal. Like I said, it was programs done by the federal government to help make the U.S. stronger and bring us out of the Great Depression. And like I said, many of these programs still exist today. And at the beginning of the video, I told you that it gave federal government a lot more power. Before this, the federal government's job was really just to deal mainly with states that were having issues, either between each other or by themselves were having an issue. But because the Great Depression hit the entire world pretty equally, the entire U.S. was struggling, and so the federal government had to step up and do a lot more things than they'd ever done before, and it gave them a lot more power going forward. And a lot of those powers they never gave up. And so our federal government grew dramatically during this time period, but it did help a lot of people. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.